Like it will always feel a little bit like home when we come back, right? Even just driving here, I'm just filled with all the memories of biking with Max and Steve and Nick far too often, right? Playing many, many, many hours of disc golf with Cody and Ben, more than I probably should have instead of studying, and all the other things that we did, right? And all the many meals that Ken and Marie would send home with me after doing house projects. All those different things come rushing back in the moment we drive out of Tibet Canyon and pull into Grand Junction. So needless to say, this city, and more specifically this family, will always feel like family, always feel like home. So it feels like a privilege to get to be here and speak to you guys. And thank you to everybody who came and celebrated our little boy yesterday. We're super excited for that as well. Let's jump in. From what I understand, your theme and focus for the year is this word thrive. Right? It's this idea that we can thrive in any life stage or season with Jesus, right? And as Max was saying, you've been going through this I am statement series found in the book of John. So go over to John 15. That's where we're going to find the last one. Now, I went through, and this is kind of nerdy. I do this kind of stuff a lot. But I went through and listened to all of Max's sermons on this series before writing this one, because I felt like I needed to be prepared. It felt weird coming into a series that I didn't listen to. So 3 things stuck out to me as I listened to all of those sermons. Jesus only, Jesus always, and Jesus forever. Those are kind of the 3 things that just kept sticking out, right? The idea of Jesus only. Each of these I am statements say, I am the blank, right? None of them say, I am a gate or a light or a shepherd, right? They say, I am the, right? Jesus is the only. Right? Jesus always, repeatedly, there's this reminder that the identity of Jesus requires more than just a one-time conversion followership. It's constant relationship with Jesus. Jesus always. Right? And then Jesus forever. That Jesus is not just concerned with your life here and now. Like he does care about that, but he's concerned with your eternity. Right? He has that on his mind and in his plans all the way. He's not just the way to live. He's the way to the Father. Right? Where he's prepared a room for us. He's not just the shepherd for going in and out, but he's the gate into eternity, right? He's not just the life now, but he's the resurrection, right? And as Paul says, without the resurrection, we're still dead in our sins. Right? Like all of these identities of Jesus point out that he is concerned with our forever, right? So Jesus always, Jesus only, Jesus forever. And today's no different. In fact, I think that this one sums up all of those pretty well. So John 15, verses 1 through 8. I'll meet you there. I forgot to turn over there, so. Starting verse 1 of John 15 says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the words I have spoken to you. Remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you're like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up and thrown into the fire and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory. You bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. And I just remembered that I had all that on the screen, but you didn't know that. So it's right there, just in case you want to read it now. There's the last part of it. So if you didn't get it, I am the true vine. That's the I am statement. I'm used to looking at it in front of me. I'll get it. By the end of the sermon today, I'll get it. You'll be caught up on the slides at the same time I am. I think that this is probably my favorite I am statement of Jesus, and the one that I keep coming back to the longer I'm a disciple, right? And I think that the biggest point is the beginning here, the vine and the gardener, right? We have to focus on that. So that's the first point today out of 3. Promise it won't be that long. But I'm the vine and the gardener. Jesus says, I'm the true vine and my Father is the gardener, right? And he expands a little bit on the role of a gardener, which we'll get to in a minute. But as far as the vine, he gives very little explanation. He just says, I'm the vine and you are the branches, right? Instead, he lets the imagery of what a vine is kind of paint the picture for his disciples of what he means, right? And grapevines would have been pretty popular in Galilee, right? Populating almost every hillside there. But unless you live in or drive through Palisade on a daily basis, the image of a healthy vineyard and grapevine might kind of be lost on you, right? If you're like me, this is kind of what you think of vine. It's the ivy that grows on the outside of houses, and it's gnarly, and it's kind of obnoxious, and you can't really control where it goes as much as you try, right? That's what I picture as vine. That's not what they would have pictured. This is more what they would have pictured, is this idea of what these vines are. So if you look at this is more what Jesus is talking about, right? There's the trunk, and that's what Jesus is saying is the vine. That is him, the trunk, the vine. And then you have those cordons that go out to the side, right? And those are the branches. And then you get everything else. And we're not going to get into that because Jesus doesn't. But that's the image that would have come to mind for his disciples, is this solid trunk with the branches coming out on either side. You know, and I think that there's a couple of characteristics of a vine like this that Jesus is likening himself to as he's saying this to the disciples. First is that the vine is the only part that's planted in the dirt, right? Like none of the rest of that reaches the dirt. It's the trunk, the vine, it's just that piece itself, right? That's why in verse 5, he says, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit, right? Apart from me, you can do nothing. Branches don't just float in midair, right? Unless they're falling and dying, right? Like you don't just stick it up on a shelf and let it kind of grow, right? That doesn't work with branches. And Jesus is making clear, hey, the only hope for you to survive and to bear fruit is to be connected to me, right? Like where else are you going to get nutrients? I'm the vine. I'm the only place that you will get what you need, right? And branches have to be attached to the vine to live, right? Because that's where they get all that. And, you know, honestly, even in the dictionary definition of a branch is a part of the main line or vine, right? So even just in that definition of what we're talking about here, it's clear that we have to remain rooted in Jesus so he can provide what we need. You know, the second aspect here is that he says, I am the true vine. You know, if you didn't know, branches aren't transient, right? You don't have like a peach branch one day and the next day that same branch is the grape branch, and then, well, maybe I'll be a poplar tomorrow, or, you know, that doesn't work. You don't go branch hopping, trunk hopping, whatever. Once you're a branch in that vine, right? And I think that Jesus knows that there's more than one vine that we can try to turn to. Go over to Matthew chapter 7.
Come on, Cordell.
Again, the reality is there's many other vines out there other than Jesus, right, that we can try to put our attachments in. So Matthew 7, this is as he's closing out the Sermon on the Mount. Verse 24. Still here, a couple pages, I'll give a second. It says, therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rains came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundations on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, and the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. You know, he says here that there's an option to either A, be founded on the rock, or B, be founded in the sand. It sounds a lot like you either remain in the true vine or you wither and die. Both of those things are very clear in John 15 and Matthew 7, right? And I think that these can be anywhere. All these false vines are everywhere. Money, relationships, job titles, hobbies, right? None of those are inherently bad, but if that's where you're rooted, they're not the true vine, right? And then there's the more blatant sin of drugs and alcohol, right? Sexual immorality and infidelity, impurity, all of these different things, all false vines promising to one degree or another to fill you up, right? They're going to give you what Jesus says he can, but they never do, right? They never fulfill that promise. You know, we're designed to be fruitful in only one vine, right? God has designed us to be attached to him. And if we're not attached where we belong, right? He is the true vine that we are branches of. And I think that's just so cool in the way that he shows us that he's the true vine, right? There's nowhere else that we fit. You know, Jesus as the vine means that he is our supplier of life and our identity, right? We're not just a branch on our own. And the reality is there's no trunk hopping. We can't just kind of figure out where we want to fit day in and day out. The true source of life is only found in Jesus. But he doesn't just tell us that he's the vine. He says that the Father is the gardener, right? A gardener's sole purpose is to make sure that plants are healthy, well-maintained, well-watered, everything's going well. And Jesus tells us exactly how the Father does that, right? John 15:2 says, he cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. You know, pruning and cutting is a necessary process for growth, which is kind of a bummer, right? Wouldn't we like if it was just easy, no pruning, no cutting involved, right? We just kind of hang out and everything's good. But, you know, you produce less and less fruit if you don't prune something. And it's worse fruit, right? So it can look super healthy, and even if there's no dead branches, all these hundreds of branches that are coming out are going to produce very little, not as sweet, not as good fruit. And God knows that, right? And it says that all of this is to his glory, right? So as the gardener, he wants to make sure that he's taking care of the plants well, right? That's bringing him the glory that he deserves. But God, as the gardener, is always at work within us to do what's best for us, right? To make us healthy, to make us grow the way that he has designed. And even if it looks and feels painful at times, that's what he's doing, right? He's not just lopping off things however he sees fit, right? When I trim trees, that's kind of what I do, right? We had a painter come and trim our trees at our house, and he went crazy, right? Our trees were nice and lush and beautiful, and now it's like you can see right into the neighbor's window, and I don't like it, right? And he's not experienced. He just went and trimmed up. That's not our garden, right? Our gardener knows exactly what's best. Our gardener knows exactly where we need cut, and what to keep so we can keep growing. You know, and if you look back at this picture, I should have put it up again. Before pruning and after pruning look very different, right? And maybe it's scary when you look at the after pruning, you're like, oh, I don't want to look like that. I'd rather look like the before pruning. But it's, again, trusting that gardener knows what he's doing, right? And Jesus wants to make clear that, hey, my Father knows what he's doing, right? If I'm the true vine, he's the gardener who can make sure that you're growing correctly. You know, and I think that maybe some of that is scary. You just got a little sneak peek at the next point. But I think that it can be scary, right? Maybe you're like, okay with the pruning because you see that and you're like, all right, it's necessary. But the cutting off of fruitless branches part, that's even more scary, right? Like you don't want to talk about that one. That one is very scary. And honestly, it should sober us up to remember that the Christian life is not one where we sit on our butts and do nothing, right? Like God has called us to bear fruit. He's given us what we need to bear fruit, but he's called us to do so, right? We don't just get to sit and do nothing. But again, the awesome thing is, what does he say is the answer to bearing fruit? Remain in me, right? It's not rocket science. We don't have to figure out what the pH of the soil is, and we don't have to make sure that we cut off and keep the right spurs, and, well, we don't have to make sure if we're getting enough water and all these things. We just need to remain. Like, we just need to remain in the vine. Like, Jesus, God, they've got that covered, but we have to put in the effort not to trunk hop, right? Not to go to false vines, but stay with Jesus, right? And I think that that's the best part of this is that we're just called to be branches. Right, so our second point here is the tale of two branches. Since you already saw it, I won't let it pop up first. Tale of two branches. You know, Jesus says that he is the vine, Father's the gardener, and we're the branches. Right, and this statement from Jesus is special because all the other I am statements, he tells us about himself, right? And there's maybe a call to action out of who he is, but this is the one that he tells us who we are. Right, he gives us an identity in this one, and it's because he's speaking directly to his disciples at this point. He's like, hey, you as my follower, you are a branch, right? I'm the vine. You're the branch, right? This is the identity of being a Christian. And I think that, man, this is just so cool that he gets in here because we get to see some examples of branches in the Gospels. When I say the name Judas, what comes to your mind? Jerk. What else? Traitor. Yeah, what else? 30. Yeah, 30 pieces. Yeah. Anything else? Thief. Yeah. Thief. Oh, thief. Yep, heard that one. Yeah. You know, we can probably go on for a while of bad things, right? Thief, traitor, murderer, sellout, all of these things, right? Okay, what about Peter? What about when I ask Peter? What comes to your mind? Nothing. Rock? What else? Passion? Yeah. Silly. I won't disagree with that, yeah. Sometimes. I put down loudmouth. That's one of the things that comes. Yeah. You know, I think that within this, Judas is kind of perpetually remembered poorly, right? Because he, rightfully so, right? We read in the gospel and he made some poor choices. But Peter, even through his imperfections, and he had many, and we're going to look at those. But, man, he's remembered as faithful, right? Maybe even remembered as the rock, right? The rock of the church, all of this mentality. We remember him far differently. And I think it's because they're two very different branches, right? So we're going to look first at Judas here. Go over to John chapter 12. It's just a few chapters before where we're at this. Wow, I really about said this morning. This evening. It messes me up. I think I would love it if we lived here and we got used to it. But today I was twiddling my thumbs at like 2 o'clock. I was like, man, when do I go to church? Like, what do I do with myself today? So John chapter 12 here. We'll start in verse 1. This is this amazing story of kind of Jesus' last days on earth and this beautiful moment with Mary. We're not going to focus on Mary, but Mary's awesome. So go ahead and focus on her later. But verse 1 says 6 days before the Passover. Oh, I do have this one up here. Just to make sure. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here, a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And then the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As a keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put in it. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. We'll go ahead and stop there. And we learn a few things about Judas's character in this passage. We see that first he thought he knew better than Jesus, right? If Jesus thought that Mary was doing something wrong, it's not like he was napping at the table. Like, he would have stopped her, right? It's the Son of God. He has conviction. Like, he would have stopped her if it was wrong. But, man, he realized this is a proper act of worship on Mary's part, and he allows her to do it. But Judas objects because he thinks he knows better. He's like, Jesus, what a waste. Like, why are you allowing this? This isn't okay. Like, what are you thinking? Right? He objects to what Jesus does here. And, John offers a little commentary, which he wrote years later, right? This wasn't common knowledge at the time. But verse 6, he says, he did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As a keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put in it. So not only was Judas arrogant, he was a sinner, but he was in the dark about it, right? Because if you read in John 13, Jesus is like, one of you will betray me. And they all look around. They're like, who's that? Like, they have no idea, right? If they knew that Judas was stealing, they would probably have been like, I bet it's Judas. I bet it's him, right? This wasn't like common knowledge, right? They found this out later. Judas just lived in the dark, right? Like, Judas was not open about what was going on. And I think that understanding this, he built this whole facade of fruitfulness, right? Where I'm one of the 12, right? And there's times where he was fruitful, but man, he was obstinate and opposed to Jesus, right? And then he was in the dark about what was really going on. And the last flaw in Judas was his response to pruning, right? When it was offered, John 12, Jesus says in verse 7, leave her alone, right? It was intended that she would save the perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. This is a pruning moment. Jesus is like, hey, this is okay. Like, chill out, repent, right? Don't think like you're thinking, right? And how does he respond? Just a couple chapters later, 30 silver coins, right? He becomes a sellout of Jesus. He doesn't change. Judas became a branch that was fruitless and cut off and thrown away, right? I think that we need to see that we don't want to be that branch, right? That's not the branch we want to be like. And that's why I said this is the tale of two branches, because we're going to look at one that we do want to be like. So let's look at Peter, how he's a branch worth imitating. Again, Peter had many a problem, and we're actually going to look at how he had the same problems at times as Judas, but he responded very differently. Go over to Luke chapter 5. Look first at his calling. This comes right after Jesus tells him, hey, I know you've been fishing all night. You sucked it up. Go back out. right? Throw it over to the other side. I bet you'll catch some fish, right? So we pick up right after he does catch some fish, right? And the boat's about to sink. Verse 6 says, when they had done so, right, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners on the other boat to come and help them. Then they came and filled both boats so filled that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats on shore and left everything and followed him. Peter in that moment, he was in the presence of the Lord, and he got it, right? He's like, "Lord, get away from me," right? All the weight of his sin fell on him, and he's like, I need to stay in the dark, right? He's like, I can't be near you. Like, you're too holy for me. But then Jesus is like, no, stay here, right? Don't be afraid, right? Come follow me. And Peter does that, right? He gets this new identity beyond just his sin, but as something useful in the master's hands. And right, they pull their boats on shore and they left everything immediately and follow Jesus. Unlike Judas, when Peter was faced with a sin, he turned to Jesus, right? At first he wanted to hide, but then he followed, right? He remained, he stayed moldable, right? He clung to Jesus. If he is the vine and we're the branches, we must choose that over what Judas did, right? Just staying in the dark, not allowing pruning to help us and fix us, right? We have to trust that Jesus knows what he's doing. In Mark chapter 8, you don't have to turn there if you don't want to, but there's the classic question where Jesus is like, "Who do people say I am?" And they're like, "Well, some say this, some say that." And then Peter gets his moment. He's like, "I say you're the Messiah." You're like, "Yeah, Peter, like you got it. You finally got it." And then verse 31 comes. Right? And he says, this is Jesus. Jesus, began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. And that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan." He said, "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Peter did the exact same thing as Judas. He thinks that he knows better than Jesus. He's like, no. I know what you're saying. You've taught clearly. You're wrong. I will not let this happen. I disagree with you, Jesus. Right? And then he does this multiple times, right? This isn't the only time he does this in Scripture. Even Matthew 26 and verse 33, after Jesus is teaching the exact same thing and says everyone will fall away, Peter's like, "Hey, even if everyone falls away, I'm here. I got you." Again, he's trying to say that I know better than you, Jesus. I know better than you. And you fast forward a couple verses into the garden, even after Jesus kept telling them about this truth that he was going to be arrested, what does Peter do? Well, he lops off the ear of one of his servants. He just doesn't get it, right? He keeps thinking that he knows better than Jesus, and then he gets humbled, right? Just as Jesus promised, he denies him 3 times, right? Even to a servant girl. It wasn't like it was the Roman mafia trying to get him, right? Some little servant girl, and he's still denying Jesus. Peter repeatedly thought that he knew better than Jesus, but even when he was wrong, right, and he got corrected, because he did, and pruned by Jesus, he remained moldable, right? If you go over to John 21, we kind of see the resolution to Peter's interactions with Jesus here. They've gone back to fishing after Jesus' death, and in an incredibly similar moment to Luke 5, right? Jesus is like, "Hey, why don't you throw your nets to the other side?" And they're like, "Man, what a weird guy." They didn't know it's Jesus, right? So they're like, "What's this guy?" Okay, fine. They do it, and their boats almost sink and all this stuff. Peter jumps in the water and swims back to shore to meet Jesus. And then we see this interaction. We'll start in verse 15. It says, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them, John. Right? This is the one who would lean back against Jesus at the supper and ask, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." We'll stop right there. In asking Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" Jesus is pruning him, right? He's helping him see, he's reminding him that I'm the vine, right? Like, are you here? Are you attached? Like, are you tight with me right now? He needed to be reminded that he had to remain in Jesus and trust that Jesus was leading him somewhere good, even if he didn't understand it. And there was some pain in the pruning. Verse 17 brings that up. Peter's hurt. He's like, "Jesus, why are you asking me this? Like, of course I do. Of course I love you. Why are you asking me over and over again?" But man, that was the pruning that he needed. Because if you flip a couple pages into Acts 2, he preaches like the best sermon to thousands of people about Jesus after he had left and went back to fishing, right? So obviously this pruning process was bearing fruit, right? And we had to remember that, and that's what Jesus being the vine is all about, right? We have to remain in him even when it's hard. And you can see later in Peter's letters that he finally gets it. 1 Peter 1, you can just look on the screen. I actually put it up this time. So verses 3 through 9 says, Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. This inheritance is kept in heaven for you, who through faith are shielded by God's power until the coming salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Though you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him. You are filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy, for you're receiving the end result of your faith, the salvation of your souls. I think in those words, Peter finally understood what this whole pruning, remaining in Jesus stuff meant, right? It produced a fruitful faith, one that was tested, right? One that was of greater worth than gold, right? He finally gets it. You finally get it, right? Let me ask you, if you were to be real with yourself, are you more like Peter or Judas right now, right? Just in your own ability to remain in Jesus and take pruning, right? Do you think you know better than Jesus? Or maybe a better question, do you live like you know better than Jesus, right? Because if you're honest, you're probably not going to say you think you know better than Jesus, but you might live that way, right? Are you making decisions apart from prayer and advice and trusting in false vines to support your life? Do you walk in the light, knowing that God is here to prune you for your good, not for your shame, right? It's for your good that we walk in the light. Or do you stay in the dark for fear of your deeds being exposed, as it says in John 3, right? Do you respond humbly to God's pruning, allowing him to mold you and shape you, even if it hurts, right? Or do you flee like Judas and become more of a sellout rather than being sold out? We want to be fruitful branches in the vine, amen? That's what we all want. We don't just want to kind of exist, right? And this is all for the Father's glory. So the last point here is the vine life. Once we get there we go. The vine life. Peter hits on this in the passage that we just read, but the purpose of remaining in the vine is so we can thrive. And that's why I brought up that that's your theme for the year, right? That Jesus wants us to thrive. It's not just a terrible life living in the vine. 1 Peter 3, 8 and 9, right? We just read it, but though you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him. And you're filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy, for you're receiving the end result of your faith, salvation of your souls. There's an inexpressible and glorious joy. Like, just think about that for a minute. The fact that you or I can't express how glorious that joy is, that should make you excited, right? Like, there's something bigger than we can even imagine on the line here, right? And that's what all these I am statements that you just looked at point to, is that Jesus is wanting to fill us with something so we can thrive, right? That it's not just, I just got to remain. Man, life is just tough. Like, yeah, it is tough, and we do have to just remain, but there's something better, right? There's an end result of your faith. It's not just faith for faith's sake, right? We get to go somewhere with this. It's the truth in John 10:10. You've already looked at this, but the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come, Jesus, I have come, that I may have life and have it to the full. Man, that's good. Like thinking that Jesus came with that express purpose, that you can have life to the full in him. Jesus provides us with that. Not life to the halfway or life to the kind of, right? Life to the just get you by, but life to the fullest degree. One that fills you with the inexpressible and glorious joy that Peter wrote about. One that bears fruit that brings God as the gardener glory. One that gives security, knowing that all we need, we receive from the vine if we remain in him. The promise of the vine life is good, right? Like remaining in Jesus is good. Like it's not just a wrestling match all the time. And that's a truth that we can build our hope on. But here's the kicker. The beginning of John 10:10 is also true, right? It says, the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. There's an enemy, a thief, right? Peter describes him as a roaring lion, prowling around looking for someone to devour. Jesus speaks about the effect of this reality, the reality of a thief, in Matthew 24, verses 12 and 13. Be up on the screen. After telling his disciples that persecution and hardship will come, he says, because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Jesus says because of these attacks of Satan, the roaring lion, most will grow cold and turn away. But, again, there's a big turning point moment. I'm not going to say a big but because that just is wrong. I know Ben was waiting for it, right? But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. That sounds a lot like remain in me, right? That sounds exactly the same language. The one who remains will be saved. The truth is that every moment Satan is doing his best to pull you apart and drag you away from Jesus, right? Doing everything he can to compromise your faith in Jesus. Satan does not want you to thrive, right? We just saw that truth. He comes to steal and to kill and destroy, right? It's not like he just kind of wants to bless you. He doesn't want any of it, right? He wants you to grow cold and for you to give up. But in Jesus, you have everything you need to thrive, right? You have everything you need to get away from that, right? To push back against those attacks, to flee from those attacks. Right? You have a gate and a shepherd to watch over you as sheep, right? You have light to guide you, right? You have bread to sustain you. You have the way, the truth, and life to follow, right? You have a resurrected eternity to look forward to. The only thing is required that you remain, right? That you abide, that you continue to stay with Jesus, and allow him to sustain you and to mold you and to prune you and to shape you, to do all the things to make you fruitful for his glory. As we wrap up, I'm going to pray for our communion, but I encourage you to remember what he did so you can thrive, right? It doesn't just come free, right? It's free to us. I'm really grateful for that, but it wasn't free, right? Jesus paid a very, very high price, right? The price of his life on the cross so that we can thrive. And all we have to do is just remain in Jesus, right? And he makes us fruitful. So I'm going to pray, and then we'll close out with some songs. Father God, thank you so much just for being the vine that we need. God, I'm so grateful that I don't have to try to figure this out on my own. God, that none of us have to try to figure it out on our own, trying to bear fruit apart from you. God, trying to find which vine is the right vine, just knowing that you are. God, that you are all these I am statements, that you are enough for us, that you're more than enough for us. God, I do just pray that just help us to remember what it costs. God, your body broken, your blood shed on the cross for us. God, thank you for your grace. Thank you for being willing to do that and go to the cross, even knowing that the love of most will grow cold. God, and I pray that in this room that this would not be the most. God, that we would be the ones who remain, right? The ones who don't shrink back like in Hebrews. God, that we would be the ones who remain faithful to the end. God, and then we get to see you in eternity and just thank you in person, right? For everything that you've done to get us there. We love you. We thank you and we praise you. In your name, amen.